In March 2005, the board of Toys R Us gathered in Wayne, New Jersey to sign away a company that was still making money. The buyers were three of the most respected names in finance: Kohlberg Kravis Roberts, Bain Capital, Vornado Realty Trust. The price was $6.6 billion. The board accepted, shareholders collected $26.75 a share, and the press called it a rescue. It was not a rescue. The three firms put up roughly $1.3 billion of their own money. The rest, more than $5 billion, was borrowed. And in a leveraged buyout, the borrower is not the firm doing the buying. The debt was placed directly onto Toys R Us itself. The company was made to take out the loan that purchased the company. Overnight, a retailer whose balance sheet was about 70% equity became one that was 78% debt. A business that earned a few $100 million in operating profit now owed $400 to $500 million every year just in interest. Every dollar that might have rebuilt its stores or its website would instead go to its lenders. That signing, in an office park in Wayne, New Jersey, in the spring of 2005, was the moment Toys R Us began to die. It would take 13 years, but the math was already finished. You would not know any of that from looking at Toys R Us in the early 1990s. Toys R Us in 1990 was not struggling. Toys R Us in 1990 controlled 25.4% of every toy sold in the United States. 1 out of every 4. No competitor was close. The company had built something new in American retail, the category killer. Charles Lazarus stocked toys year-round in warehouse-sized stores at prices 20 to 50% below everyone else. The climb had been relentless. In 1978, the year it went public, Toys R Us ran 72 stores and held 5% of the market, earning about $36 million. 5 years later, it had 169 stores and 12.5%. Smaller chains could not match the volume, and one by one they died trying. Lionel Kitty City, once the second largest toy chain in the country with 150 stores, filed for bankruptcy in 1991. Child World, the number 3 chain with 82 locations, liquidated in 1992. Toys R Us did not just beat its rivals, it outlived them. By 1998, the company operated 1,454 stores, 698 toy stores in the United States, 441 international toy stores across 27 countries, 215 Kids R Us clothing stores, 98 Babies R Us stores. Net sales had grown from $4 billion in 1988 to over $11 billion. The Babies R Us division alone made the company the clear leader of a $25 billion juvenile products market. The company was so dominant it became an instrument of American trade policy. When Toys R Us tried to enter Japan, local shopkeepers called it the Black Ship of Kawasaki, after the warships that forced Japan open in the 1800s. Nintendo refused to sell to it directly, so in January 1992, President George H.W. Bush flew by helicopter to a store opening in Kashihara, stood beside Charles Lazarus, and used the moment to celebrate the dismantling of Japanese trade barriers. A toy store had become a symbol of a nation's economic power, and the brand had escaped the stores entirely. Geoffrey the Giraffe was a household character. The jingle, "I don't want to grow up, I'm a Toys R Us kid," was something a generation of American children could sing from memory. Being a Toys R Us kid was not a slogan. It was an identity parents handed down. This was a company that had won so completely its name had become a synonym for childhood. To understand how a company that dominant could be dismantled within a single decade, you have to understand what Toys R Us actually was and how it was built. To find out, we have to go back to the beginning. Washington, D.C., 1948. Charles Lazarus was 24 years old, just back from the Army, where he had served as a cryptographer in the Second World War. His father ran a bicycle repair shop in the city. Lazarus had grown up poor, and he was direct about what he wanted. "I was poor," he later told Forbes. "I wanted to be rich." He watched the men of his generation come home from the war, marry, and start families. The baby boom was beginning. Lazarus saw a market forming before most people had a word for it. He started selling baby cribs and furniture inside a corner of his father's bike shop. He called it Children's Supermart. Then he noticed the flaw in his own business. Furniture lasted, A family bought one crib and never came back. But the customers kept asking him a question. Did he sell toys? Toys broke. Children outgrew them. Children wanted more of them, constantly, forever. A toy was not a purchase. A toy was a subscription a parent could never cancel. So in 1957, Lazarus opened a store in Rockville, Maryland, stocked with nothing but toys. He modeled it on a supermarket. Wide aisles. Shopping carts. Items stacked high on industrial shelves, sold cheap in enormous variety all year round. This was the founding insight, and it was a genuine break from how toys had always been sold. Toys had been a seasonal business, a Christmas business, sold in small quantities at department store counters. Lazarus turned toys into a year-round category sold at warehouse scale. He named it Toys R Us, with the R turned backward, drawn to look as if a child had written it. He created a mascot, a giraffe named Jeffrey. The details were deliberate. Lazarus understood that he was not selling to children. He was selling to parents through children. The whole store was engineered to make a child point and a parent reach for a cart. The model worked through volume. Lazarus bought in quantities no small store could match, negotiated prices no rival could touch, and passed the savings on to undercut everyone in town. He sold diapers near cost to pull parents through the doors, knowing they would leave their savings on toys before they left the building. Each store was a machine for converting a child's wonder into a parent's spending. It almost ended before it began. In 1966, Lazarus sold the business to Interstate Department Stores for $7.5 million, staying on to run the toy division. 8 years later, in 1974, Interstate collapsed into bankruptcy. The parent company that owned Toys R Us was insolvent. But the toy division Lazarus ran was the one healthy thing inside the wreckage. He led the reorganization around it, and in 1978, the company emerged from bankruptcy and went public as Toys R Us, with Lazarus back in control. Remember that year. 1974. The first time Toys R Us nearly died, it was killed by a parent company drowning in problems that had nothing to do with toys. The second time, the cause would be exactly the same. Lazarus had survived a bankruptcy he did not create. 30 years later, his company would not survive a second one. From there, the machine ran without resistance. By 1978, 72 stores. By 1983, 169 stores and 12.5% of the market. By 1990, more than a quarter of every toy sold in America moved through a Toys R Us. Lazarus had become, in 1987, the highest-paid executive in the United States, earning more than $60 million in a single year. He had built exactly what he set out to build at 24 in his father's bike shop. He had wanted to be rich, and he had made himself one of the richest retailers alive by understanding one thing better than anyone. A toy is the only product a happy childhood requires you to keep buying. That was the empire. To understand why it was so easy to destroy, you have to understand the one thing that made it valuable. And it was not the stores. This is the part that most people miss. The story everyone tells about Toys R Us is that Amazon killed it. That is not what happened. To understand what happened, you need to understand what a toy actually was to this company's business. A toy was a thin-margin product. Toys R Us had built its entire empire on selling toys cheaply, which meant it never made much on any single item. It made money the way a casino does, on volume and on traffic. The model only worked if the company stayed the cheapest and the biggest. The moment someone else could sell the same toy for less, the entire machine was exposed. That someone arrived in the 1990s, and it was not online. It was Walmart and Target. These were general retailers. Toys were not their business. They could sell a hot toy at a loss during the holidays, as bait to fill a shopping cart with groceries and clothing, and never feel it. Toys R Us could not. Toys were the only thing it sold. Selling them at a loss was not a tactic. It was suicide. By 1998, Walmart had passed Toys R Us to become the largest toy seller in the United States. The category killer had been outflanked by stores that did not even specialize in the category. But that was survivable. A wounded company can recover. To kill it, you had to take away its ability to fight back. And here is the structural trap. The thing that made the collapse inevitable. It was not the competition. It was the debt. For most of its life, Toys R Us was financed conservatively. Its capital structure was roughly 70% equity and 30% debt. In 2004, the year before the buyout, this was not a dying company. It held over $1 billion in cash. It had generated $746 million in operating cash flow that year, $801 million the year before. Its annual interest expense was about $130 million, comfortable for a business that size. The company had problems, but it had the one thing every struggling company needs to fix its problems. It had money to spend. The leveraged buyout took that away. When KKR, Bain, and Vornado bought the company in 2005, they did not pay for it themselves. They put up about $1.3 billion and borrowed more than $5 billion. And in the mechanics of a leveraged buyout, the borrowed money is not the buyer's burden. The debt is placed on the company being purchased. Toys R Us was made to take out the loan that bought Toys R Us. Its capital structure flipped from 70% equity to 78% debt. Now follow the math, because the math is the whole story. Interest expense went from about $130 million a year to over $400 million a year. In some years, the company generated only $150 million in operating profit while owing $400 million in interest. The debt did not just cost money. It consumed everything the business produced and then demanded more. Some of the loans carried payment-in-kind provisions, meaning that in a lean year the unpaid interest did not disappear. It compounded. The debt grew while the company shrank, and the loans came with covenants. Toys R Us could not make major capital investments without its lenders' approval. The company that needed, more than anything, to modernize its stores and build a real website was now legally restrained from spending on either without permission from the people it owed money to. So consider what that meant in the exact years it mattered most. Between 2005 and 2017, Amazon was investing billions of dollars a year into fulfillment centers, technology, and logistics. Jeff Bezos had specifically targeted toys as a category to win. In those same years, Toys R Us was sending more than $400 million a year to its creditors. One company was spending every dollar it could find on the future. The other was forbidden from doing so because every dollar it earned was already promised to its lenders. The trap was now complete, and it had a terrible symmetry. The owners who loaded the company with debt also collected fees from it. KKR, Bain, and Vornado charged Toys R Us $15 million a year in advisory fees, rising 5% annually, and pulled out roughly $470 million in fees and interest over the life of the deal. The same parties who starved the company of capital were being paid by the company for the privilege of owning it. The company saw the danger. Its own executives understood that the debt was strangling it. Years later, in his bankruptcy filing, the final CEO would write that the over-leveraged capital structure had kept the company from making the operational and capital investments it needed, including revitalizing its stores. They knew. They could see exactly what the debt was doing. They simply could not stop it because the debt was no longer a problem the company could solve. It was the company's reason for existing, from the perspective of the men who owned it. This is not a story about a retailer that failed to see Amazon coming. This is a story about what happens when a healthy company is bought with its own money and then forbidden from defending itself. Every decision that followed would make a terrible kind of sense. The first warning came 5 years before the buyout, and it did not look like a warning. It looked like a solution. To understand why Toys R Us made the decision it made in 2000, you have to understand what had happened the previous Christmas. In the 1999 holiday season, Toys R Us ran its own website, and it was a catastrophe. Orders poured in. The company could not ship them. Children's gifts ordered weeks early did not arrive by Christmas morning. The Federal Trade Commission fined Toys R Us $50,000 for failing to deliver on time. The company had tried e-commerce and humiliated itself in front of the country. It had not been for lack of belief in the internet. In February 2000, Toys R Us took a $60 million investment from SoftBank, the Japanese conglomerate that would later pour billions into Silicon Valley. At the turn of the millennium, Toys R Us was a hot digital property. It had money, attention, and a brand every parent knew. What it did not have was the ability to ship a box on time. So in August 2000, Toys R Us made a decision that, in the moment, looked smart. It signed a 10-year exclusive partnership with Amazon. Under the deal, Toys R Us would be the exclusive seller of toys and baby products on Amazon's platform. Toys R Us would handle the buying and the merchandising. Amazon would handle the website, the payments, and the shipping. Toys R Us agreed to pay Amazon roughly $50 million a year, plus a cut of sales, and committed a reported $200 million over the life of the deal. It is the summer of 2000. The dot-com bubble is near its peak. The conventional wisdom is that pure online retailers will crush the old brick-and-mortar chains. Toys R Us has just been burned trying to build its own site. Amazon is the most advanced e-commerce operation on Earth. Handing the website to Amazon means never having another Christmas like 1999. The press called it a model for the future, the template for how physical retailers would survive the internet. The conclusion was correct. The lesson drawn from it was catastrophically wrong. Toys R Us concluded it was bad at running a website. The real lesson was that it needed to get good at running a website, because the website was about to become the store. Instead, the company decided it never had to learn. It outsourced the single most important capability of its own future to the one company most determined to take that future for itself. For a few years, the deal worked for both sides. It eliminated the inventory problems that had plagued Amazon and let Toys R Us compete online with eToys and Walmart without building anything. Then, by spring 2003, other merchants began selling toys and baby goods on Amazon. That summer, Jeff Bezos and his executives sat down with Toys R Us management and demanded a wider assortment of merchandise. Competing toys kept appearing on Amazon anyway, including in the search ads. Bezos and his team argued the exclusivity clause covered only Amazon's own first-party sales, not third-party listings. From the Toys R Us side, this was a flat violation. Customers searching Amazon for toys now saw competitors beside the Toys R Us listings on the very platform Toys R Us was paying to control. In May 2004, Toys R Us sued. The case ran for 2 years. In 2006, a New Jersey Superior Court judge, Margaret Mary McVeigh, ruled that Amazon had breached the agreement. She was unimpressed by Amazon's witnesses. Of Jeff Bezos' testimony, she wrote that she had no doubt his understanding of the agreement went much deeper than he revealed on the stand. Toys R Us won the right to leave the partnership and build its own site again. 3 years later, Amazon paid $51 million to settle. Toys R Us won the lawsuit. It had already lost the thing the lawsuit was about. For 6 years, from 2000 to 2006, the company had no independent e-commerce operation. Every online toy customer in America had been trained to buy toys on Amazon. Amazon had spent those 6 years studying the toy market from the inside, learning the best sellers, the seasonal patterns, the pricing, using a blue-chip partner to master a category it intended to dominate. Toys R Us had paid Amazon every year to be taught how to destroy it. The company emerged in 2006 with a legal victory and a website a decade behind, and it had no time to fix it. Because, in 2005, while the lawsuit was still in court, the people who now owned Toys R Us had loaded it with the debt that made fixing anything impossible. But it gets worse. The trap had been visible even before the buyout. In May 2000, the board installed John Eyler, formerly of FAO Schwarz, as CEO. Eyler launched a plan to remodel the stores and relaunch the chain, fighting the Walmart and Target threat head-on. He was trying to reinvent the company while it still had its own cash to spend. It was the last moment Toys R Us controlled its own money. 5 years later, the buyout took that control away, and no turnaround was possible once every spare dollar was promised to lenders. Still, for a while, the owners believed they could escape. The plan in a leveraged buyout is never to hold forever. It is to fix the company, take it public again, and sell the shares at a profit. So, Toys R Us tried to leave through the only exit that mattered. It filed to go public again, planning an IPO to raise cash and pay down the debt. The market would not take it. The company filed in 2010 and waited, and in 2013, it withdrew the offering entirely. There would be no escape through the public markets. The owners were trapped inside the same company they had trapped. Vornado eventually wrote its $428 million investment down to zero. The financial engineers had engineered themselves into a corner with no door, and the clock did not stop. The company had not earned an annual profit since 2013. Every year, it sent more than $400 million to its lenders. Every year, its stores aged a little further while Walmart, Target, and Amazon kept investing. By early 2017, Toys R Us was losing money at an accelerating rate. It reported a net loss of $164 million in a single spring quarter against a $106 million loss in the same quarter a year before. And ahead of it sat a wall it could not climb: $400 million in debt coming due in 2018 and $1.7 billion due in 2019. This is where the math became fatal. The company generated roughly 40% of its annual revenue in the Christmas season. To stock shelves for Christmas, it needed its suppliers, Mattel, Hasbro, and hundreds of others, to ship toys on credit through the fall. That credit was the oxygen the whole business breathed. And credit depends on one thing only: the belief that you will still be there to pay. In early September 2017, that belief broke. CNBC reported that Toys R Us had hired debt advisors and was weighing bankruptcy. Other outlets followed, and the moment the reports hit, the suppliers did the only rational thing: they clammed up. Vendors who had shipped on trust for decades now demanded cash on delivery, or payment in advance, or settlement of everything already owed. Nearly 40% of the company's vendors refused to ship without cash. The company also lost the credit insurers and factoring parties that quietly underwrote its trade. A court document later called it a dangerous game of dominoes. This was the moment denial gave way to panic. The company that had spent 12 years insisting it could manage its debt now could not buy inventory for the season that made its year. On September 18, 2017, Toys R Us filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. CEO Dave Brandon called it the dawn of a new era and said the financial constraints that had held the company back would finally be addressed. It was not a new era. It was the run on the bank. The bankruptcy was supposed to be a controlled restructuring, a way to shed debt and fight on. To survive it, the company borrowed another $3.1 billion just to operate through the courts, with bankruptcy lawyers billing upward of $1,000 an hour. But the filing itself had confirmed to every supplier exactly what they feared, and the company kept buying. Creditors later alleged in court that as Toys R Us missed its holiday targets in late 2017, executives accelerated orders in January and February of 2018 and pressured suppliers to keep shipping on credit, even after they had likely triggered a default on the bankruptcy loan. When the liquidation came, those vendors collectively lost hundreds of millions of dollars in trade credit, eventually settling for pennies on the dollar. The company walked into bankruptcy hoping to reorganize. It had, in the act of filing, guaranteed it never would. The plan in bankruptcy was never to die. The plan was to close the weak stores, shed the debt, and emerge leaner. In early 2018, Toys R Us announced the first wave of closures, around 180 stores. Workers were told the survivors would be saved and that those who stayed would receive severance. Then the holiday numbers came in, and they were worse than the worst projection. With thin shelves and nervous customers, the 2017 Christmas season failed. The bankruptcy loan covenants tripped. The lenders who had kept the company alive in Chapter 11 decided there was nothing left to save. On March 15, 2018, Dave Brandon filed to wind down the entire United States business and liquidate the inventory in all 735 American stores. "I am very disappointed with the result," he said, "but we no longer have the financial support to continue the company's USS operations." There was no reorganized Toys R Us on the other side. There was only the going out of business sale. The end came fast after that. Liquidation sales ran through the spring, discounts climbing toward 95% as the shelves emptied. The real estate was carved up and sold to Big Lots, to Raymer and Flanigan, to Target, the same competitor that had helped end it. On June 29, 2018, the last Toys R Us stores in America closed their doors. Roughly 33,000 people lost their jobs. And here, the story turned cruel in a way the spreadsheets had not predicted. Toys R Us had a severance policy stretching back decades, 1 week of pay for every year of service. When the company liquidated, that policy vanished. In a Chapter 11, severance and pensions are unsecured debt near the back of the line. More than 30,000 workers, many with 20 or 30 years inside the company, were told they would receive nothing. They learned, at the same time, that executives had collected millions in bonuses just before and after the bankruptcy filing. The workers organized. A group called United for Respect pressured the owners in public, hearing after hearing, until late in 2018, KKR and Bain set aside a $20 million fund for the laid-off employees. The workers were owed an estimated $75 million in severance. They received less than a third of it. In the bankruptcy itself, the lawyers were paid $56 million. The workers' fund was $2 million. The math of the collapse was consistent to the very end. The people who arranged the debt were paid first. The people who built the brand were paid last, or not at all. There is one more detail, and it is the kind that fiction would reject as too neat. On March 22, 2018, 1 week after the company filed to liquidate, and 1 day before the going out of business sales began, Charles Lazarus died. He was 94. The man who opened a toy store in Rockville, Maryland, in 1957, who turned childhood wonder into the largest toy empire on Earth, did not outlive the company he built. He died as it was being taken apart, killed by a debt he had never borrowed. Today, Toys R Us still exists, but not as a company that runs stores. It exists as a brand, a license, owned by a New York firm called WHP Global, which bought it in 2021. The giraffe is back. There are flagship stores again, shop-in-shops inside Macy's, seasonal pop-ups. The name appears on toys around the world. But the thing that owns the name is a licensing operation, not the retailer that employed a city's worth of people. At its peak, Toys R Us employed more than 60,000 people and ran nearly 1,500 stores across dozens of countries. When it liquidated in 2018, it put roughly 33,000 Americans out of work, most of them with no severance. The phrase, "a generation grew up singing, 'I don't want to grow up, I'm a Toys R Us kid,' outlived the company that wrote it. The jingle is still in people's heads. The stores it was written to fill are gone. Here is what the story of Toys R Us actually shows. It was not killed by Amazon, and it was not killed by Walmart. Those were the weather. It was killed by a financial structure that took a profitable company, made it borrow the cost of its own purchase, and then forbade it from spending on the future while demanding $400 million a year for the past. A leveraged buyout does not need a company to fail. It only needs the company to keep paying. Toys R Us did not run out of customers. It ran out of permission to fight for them.